Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into a pretty puzzling new trade dispute, one that really seems to defy all the usual economic logic. It's a fascinating story about tariffs being used as a weapon, a political grudge, and what it all tells us about how global power actually works.
And right off the bat, we run into the central mystery here. Normally when you hear about trade wars, they're about fixing deficits, where you're buying way more from a country than you're selling to them. But with Brazil, the US has the complete opposite situation. So, what is really going on?
That's right. For nearly 2 decades, the U.S. has consistently, year after year, sold more to Brazil than it's bought from them. In fact, Brazil's President Lula recently said that surplus was over $400 billion in just the last 15 years. So this is definitely not a trade deficit problem. And that's exactly what makes the White House's opening move so confusing.
Okay, so let's unpack how this all kicked off, because it started with a really sudden and frankly very aggressive move from Washington.
40%. That was the number. This was the threat that sent absolute shockwaves all the way from Brasilia to Wall Street. Seemingly out of nowhere, an executive order threatened this massive, punitive tariff on pretty much all goods coming from Brazil.
And the official reason given? Well, it was even more stunning. The White House actually declared a national emergency, using this incredibly strong language to describe what historic ally was doing. Think about that. In just one sentence, Brazil went from being a partner to being labeled a threat to the United States.
As you can imagine, Brazil's response was fast and it was sharp, and it immediately set up this clash of two totally different stories.
So here's the core of the disagreement. The U.S. says, hey, we're doing this to defend free speech and political freedom, pointing specifically to the case of former President Bolsonaro. Brazil's response? They fired right back, basically saying, this is you meddling in our country's internal business and attacking the independence of our courts. So you have two governments with two completely opposite, irreconcilable narratives.
President Lula, he did not mince words. He made his feelings crystal clear. He framed this whole thing as just an arrogant overreach by the U.S., a personal violation, really, of the basic respect that should exist between two sovereign nations.
But, to really understand what's driving this dispute, you have to look past those official statements. You have to see the deep political connection that's sitting right at the heart of it.
And it didn't take long for analysts to point out what seemed, well, pretty obvious to a lot of people. This was not about economics. This was about politics. The tariffs weren't a tool for commerce. They were being used as a political weapon, maybe to settle a very personal score.
When you lay out the timeline, that connection becomes almost impossible to ignore. Just look at the sequence of events. Former President Bolsonaro, who is a close political ally of the White House, starts facing these very serious legal charges in Brazil for trying to overturn his election, and then, boom, suddenly the U.S. declares Brazil a national threat and threatens these crippling tariffs.
And if there was any doubt left, the U.S. president pretty much cleared it up himself. He directly, explicitly linked the tariffs to Bolsonaro's legal troubles, calling it a disgraceful political attack, and then adding that he, personally, knows a lot about that kind of thing.
But then, things took a turn. Just as fast as this whole thing started, the economic battlefield completely and dramatically shifted. Almost right after that huge 40% threat was made, a new executive order came out. And this one, it set the tariff rate for Brazil at a much, much lower 10%. So what happened? Why the sudden drastic change? Well, one analyst, Tiago Aragel, has a pretty compelling theory. He says this is a classic negotiating tactic. That huge 40% threat was never the real goal. It was a decoy. It was designed to create maximum anxiety, maximum pressure. Then you swoop in with the real number, 10%, which suddenly seems so reasonable by comparison, and you force the other side to the negotiating table.
And if you look closer at what was actually being targeted, that decoy theory starts to make a whole lot of sense. Sure, major exports like coffee and meat products were on the list, things that would create a big political headline. But a whole bunch of economically vital products like civil aircraft, energy, steel, even fertilizers, they were all quietly exempted.
Get this, in total, more than 700 different product categories were left out of that initial, supposedly devastating tariff.
So you see, this wasn't some kind of economic sledgehammer designed to crash Brazil's entire economy. It was more like a surgical operation, designed to apply targeted, psychological pressure to achieve a very specific political goal.
So what's the big takeaway here? What does this all mean for the bigger picture? Well, this whole episode is a really powerful signal of how international relations might be changing.
Now, Brazil isn't just taking this lying down. President Lula has laid out a whole playbook in response. He's saying, yes, we'll negotiate, but he's adamant that Brazil will not be humiliated. He's already working to strengthen ties with other partners like the EU, leveraging Brazil's own valuable resources, and maybe most importantly, he's trying to rally his fellow BRICS nations for a coordinated response.
And what we're seeing here, it's a perfect textbook example of something called economic statecraft. It's this idea that you use economic tools like tariffs, not just for boring trade stuff, but as a weapon to achieve your foreign policy goals. It's all about leveraging your economic power for geopolitical gain.
And President Lula's threat here, it really shows just how high the stakes could get. By vowing to coordinate with other major economies like China and India, he's sending a clear message: two can play at this game. And using tariffs as a weapon could very well ignite a much, much larger economic conflict.
Which leaves all of us with a really critical question for the future. In a world where these powerful economic tools can be whipped out with just the stroke of a pen, are the old rules of diplomacy, the carefully negotiated treaties, becoming a thing of the past? That's something we'll all be watching. Thanks for joining The Explainer.